is Stories to Share. My name is Sean Driscoll, and I'm a vice president here at the Civic Center, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's presentation. Stories to Share is a series of talks started by Joe Seinfeld that we hold on the first Friday of the month here at the Civic Center during the winter. We're actually taking next month, January, off, so there won't be a talk next month, but then we'll pick up again in February. We're able to do these talks because of the people who support the Civic Center, and this series in particular because of our sponsors. They are the Monadnock Ledger Transcript, Bell Tates, and the Savings Bank of Walpole. Can we give them a round of applause? If you have a cell phone on, it would be great if you turned it off, or just a reminder so that it doesn't interrupt the talk. What's going to happen, the logistics of it are that Colton will speak. He can have the hour, but if he finishes early, we may take some questions. But we'll stop at 6 o'clock. And then after the talk, there will be a reception in the conference room, graciously provided by Jean Duval and Nancy Beltate. And we hope you'll stay after to talk to other people in the audience and possibly ask Colton a couple questions. When I was putting together the materials for this, I realized that even in our day of lots of cell phones and instant communications, we may not be much better at communicating than we were before we had all that stuff. And Colton has a really good webpage. I encourage you to look at it. And I went through the interviews that you have on there and the podcasts. And what I discovered in watching those items was that if you want to learn about listening, the person you should listen to is an interrogator. So Colton worked 22 years with the FBI, the first part of it in rural Alaska, and then he moved to a thing called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. And that took him to working in over 20 different countries. Since retiring, he's the founder and principal consultant of Pyxis Academy, which trains investigators from various agencies. The other thing that I asked him was, for someone who's been in so many places and lived in rural Alaska, how did you end up in Peterborough? And he said that he's a fan of microbreweries, and lucky for us, when the Post and Beam opened, he and his wife came up to check it out, and they fell in love with the area, which really warms my heart, because we all know and love the Monadnock region, but it's just, I can't tell you how gratifying it is to find out that other people still land here and see what we see and decide to move here. So as a relative newcomer, I would like us all to give a warm welcome, a Jaffrey Civic Center welcome to Mr. Colton Seale.
All right, well, thank you. When Sean asked me to do this, you get that feeling of like excitement, like somebody actually wants to hear me talk. And then that translates into terror, because you're like, what am I going to talk about? And what if nobody shows up, right? And then you come here and you see an entire room full of people, and that terror just continues, because you're like, oh my God, now I actually have to do this. But then you start talking, and then all of a sudden it's fun. So I look forward to tonight, but I want to leave tonight now and go back to 1999. And 1999, that's not 1999, but 1999, I'm a brand new FBI agent. I've got my shiny badge, my creds, my gun, and a head full of everything that I'd learned at Quantico. Right? And I think I'm pretty cool. Inaccurately, perhaps, but I think I'm pretty cool. And I think given all of this, people are just going to spontaneously talk to me. They're just going to tell me all the stuff that I need to know. Right? We'll see how well that worked out. So about 2 weeks into my first office, I get my first real case assigned to me, and it's a kidnapping case. And it's a 9-year-old girl who's been kidnapped, and she's been kidnapped by her father, but it turns out she's never actually met her father. right? So it's not a traditional parental kidnapping, and my supervisor, I think, didn't actually look at the case before he assigned it to the new guy, but lucky for me, that happened, and I got my first case. So I go to interview the mom, and I go up there, and she tells me about the factual stuff behind the kidnapping, that the father had shown up in town, she had heard he was around, she kind of knew where he was staying, hadn't seen him, he shows up at the school, has a birth certificate for the daughter, says, hey, this is my daughter, family emergency, I need to take her out of school. And for whatever reason, the school said, yeah, that sounds reasonable. So she is gone now. And so then I asked the mom, tell me about your relationship with the father. And she tells me that's not relevant. And so I tell her, well, to me it is relevant because I need to understand what's happening here, what's this dynamic, and I need to understand him if I'm to find your daughter, right? And she literally shuts down, won't talk to me. Now fast forward about 11 years, and I'm in a Pakistani prison, and I'm talking to a guy who's Pakistani Taliban, and he's been lobbing grenades into markets, killing people and the like, and he also played a role in planning an attack in Times Square in New York. So I explained to him who I am, what I want to talk to him about, and he basically stares at me, right? Not expected, that's how most of those conversations start. Doesn't want to engage with me at first. But I notice his leg is messed up. And so actually, he was sitting on a stool like that was really uncomfortable. So I went and got him a chair and changed that out and get him more comfortable. And then I just asked him, dude, what happened to your leg? And he actually tells me, and he said, I was sitting in a tea shop reading, and when I got up to leave, I get attacked by a bunch of guys, and I don't know who they are, so I start fighting back, and one of them runs over my leg with a motorcycle, and then they put a hood over my head, and they handcuff me, and next thing I know, I'm here. And so there were some human rights issues there that I had to deal with, which I did. But put yourself in my position for a minute. You want this guy to now continue talking. What do you ask him about? So I thought about it, and I'm like, well, he said he was reading, and that's kind of a strange detail to put in there. And my first thought was, well, he's probably reading terrorist stuff, and I don't really care. Or maybe at best, he's reading something interesting, like the old terrorist scholar site, Kutub and the like. So I was like, well, maybe. But I'm like, I'll ask him. So, dude, what were you reading? And he said, well, I was reading this book. So I've now suddenly just forgotten what it was called. But he's reading a book about religion, and it's written by a woman who was a Catholic nun, and then she went and wrote a lot of books about religion. And I couldn't have scripted this. He goes from morose to suddenly talking animatedly about this book and how it had changed his kind of perception of religion and his life and everything. And so, I can't remember it because I now have Terror in the Name of God, thanks, stuck in my head. Yes, it's Karen Armstrong, The Battle for God, thank you. Battle for God. And I'd read the book, but I didn't tell him that at first. And I just started talking to him about it. And pretty soon we're talking about the book for a few hours, and then we're talking about the terrorist camps that he'd been in, which is what I wanted to be talking about. And then what I really wanted to be talking about was a Pakistani Taliban improvised explosive device maker, a bomb maker for the Taliban, who I needed to find. And he gives me all of that information. And then he also tells me that that bomb maker is playing around with biotoxins, right? Bad things. Right? So if we think about that, what was the difference between those two conversations? Mom has every reason to talk to me, to engage with me, right? She's scared, her daughter's gone, I'm the person who can bring her back. So conceptually, we think she's going to provide me the information I ask for. But she shuts down. Now, Faisal there had absolutely no reason to talk to me, and probably a lot of things that would have been in his best interest not to tell me, yet he tells me everything. I look at it as two kind of competing concepts. One, it's control versus curiosity, right? So with the mom, I was trying to convince her what she should tell me. I was trying to control that conversation, right? That shut her down, right? I had not created a safe space. I needed her to talk about things, but things that were going to be embarrassing and painful for her to talk about. And I hadn't allowed that space to create. But with Faisal, in the end, all I did was follow his lead, right? He basically created that safe space for him to tell me all that stuff with me just following his lead and figuring out what are the right questions I should ask that continue him talking, right? Curiosity and following that versus trying to control the situation. So that's what we want to talk about tonight some, is how do we have productive conversations rather than having competitive, combative conversations with people with whom we don't agree. How do we turn that to having collaborative and engaged conversations? Right? And I was thinking about this, right? Our society is fairly divided right now, to say the least, right? At the national level, at the local levels, how do we change that, right? By starting conversations at our level with people who we don't agree with, but having productive conversations with them. And that's what I want to talk about. So, as was said, I'm Colton Seale, and I spent 22 years in the Bureau. First 9 of those were in Anchorage, Alaska. And I got to actually travel all of Alaska, and I found that what I loved about the job was talking to other people. Right? And I got to do that on all different types of investigations. I worked gangs and drugs, I worked fraud and corruption, and ended up working a bunch of homicides and kidnappings and murder for hire and the like. So I got to talk to a lot of different types of people. Right? And I loved it almost as much as I love talking to my dogs. Not quite as much, but almost. Right? But what I found was that what I had been taught at the FBI Academy was absolutely the opposite of what actually worked in real life. Right? If you wanted to shut people down like I did with the mom, do exactly what you were taught at the FBI Academy. Right? If you want to open people up and get them to talk, do what I did in Pakistan, which is not what the Academy taught. Right? So in Alaska, I didn't have the research that I have now that I'm going to talk some about. I didn't have the understanding of psychology that I have now, but I had figured out a few basic things. And first among those was when you're engaging with someone, right, treat them as if they are actually another human being. Right? So a human being with, desires, wants, fears, concerns, all of that stuff, right? And shut up and listen to them. Right? Sorry, another thing that I'd figured out was that in a conversation, we can interact with someone in 3 different ways. So the first is that we're reacting to the conversation or the situation. Right? And when we're reacting, right, that's an emotional response. And what we're conveying is that my response to the situation, my reality, is what matters. Right? In a difficult conversation, that's not going to open somebody up to talk to us. Right? The second is that we can respond to them. Right? That's more cognitive. Right? We're hearing what they're saying, we're thinking about it, and we're responding. Right? The problem with that is that once somebody starts talking, about 5 words into what they're saying, we've already figured out what we're going to say next, and we're just sitting there waiting to say that, right? We're not actually listening, right? We're not actually engaging with them, which is the third thing. But with responding, we're saying, yep, my agenda is what matters. What I care about is what matters, so I'm responding to what you're saying with my agenda. That has its place in conversations, but especially with difficult conversations, that place is not at the start of that conversation. And the third is engaging with someone. Right? That's exploring their reality, recognizing that they have a reality separate from yours, and asking questions like, or saying things like, tell me more about that, or tell me how you came to feel that way. Right? We're putting their reality, their identity in center stage. Difficult conversation, that's how we get people to open up, right? Engaging versus that cognitive just responding to what they're saying. Now, I want to give you an example of that from Alaska. Sorry. So late one evening, I found myself in a crack house in Alaska. And I was leading a human trafficking task force at the time, so I'm in a crack house in Alaska talking to a teenage prostitute. And AI would not create an image that accurately reflected that crack house. It said that that was too disturbing, and no. So that's as best we can do. I'm talking to the girl, and I do need information from her, and I need her help. Right? So if we think about it, my reaction to this was essentially, right, this place is horrible, your life is a mess, and you need help and we need to get you out of here. Right? Am I telling her anything that she's not acutely aware of already? Right? No. Right? She knows that, and what I'm communicating is that how I feel about this situation is what matters. Right? That's just going to shut her down. Right? My response would be, let me lay out the situation here for you. Let me lay out for you what I need and how I can help you and how working with me is going to help you. All right? Fair enough, but what she's going to hear is this FBI guy wants me to do something that I probably don't want to do and disengage, right? He's trying to convince me to do something. So the engagement response was, which I'll admit I was kind of surprised myself doing this, that place was horrible, and it was, I don't know why, but all the clothes on the floor were soaking wet too, so it just smelled terrible. But I moved all the stuff aside and sat down on the floor with her and just said, tell me about what's going on here. Right. And she actually started talking. We talked for about 2-3 hours, and at some point she gets up, she'd hidden a scrapbook of her life somewhere in that house. She goes and finds it, comes back, sits down on the floor next to me, and we go through the entire scrapbook, right? And in the end, just listening to her and engaging with her, I get all of the information that I need to move our human trafficking investigation forward, and now I have her at a mental place where she's now willing to accept my help to get out of there. But if I'd started with my reaction, right, that's going to put her off. If I'd started with my response, here's why you need my help, it's going to put her off, but the engagement is what mattered. But an important thing here, right, engaging with someone, it's not a trick, it's not a technique, right? It can feel that way, but really it should be a fundamental stance that their reality is worth understanding. Somebody else's reality is different than yours, and that is worth understanding, right? Developing that curiosity. And I'll say quickly, I've been trying to figure out how to do that, or how to teach people how to do that, and I think the beginning part is faking it, right? You just have to ask these questions. But over time, it becomes your stance toward other people, right? You develop that skill, and it's a skill that can be developed. All right, so the whole Alaska time was fantastic, and I literally could stand up here and talk about Alaska for about 3 hours easily. But the last 4.5 years in Alaska, I'd become a supervisory special agent. I was supervising the largest public corruption case in the United States at the time. And I had about 20 agents working for me, and we were tapping people's phones and everything. So we had to be in the office, have somebody in the office 24 hours a day. So one year I went into the office every single day, 364 days, except for Thanksgiving, right? So it was exhausting. So I decided it was time for something else. So I decided to find something more exhausting. I got accepted onto the FBI's counterterrorism division fly team. And the fly team is a group of about 20, 25 agents and analysts whose role is to forward deploy to kind of hot spots around the world, right? So undergoverned spaces, kind of war zone type spaces. And our job there is to interview terrorists, collect evidence, right, and make connections with the host nation people, right? So when something bad happens there, we're there and we have the connections so that we can go out and do what we need to do, right? But it does often land you in not the best places in the world, surprisingly, and you're often there alone. So I got to spend 6 years of my career, often by myself, right? Interviewing terrorists, responding to attacks, recruiting human sources, informants, and several times getting people unkidnapped. And I will say, without a doubt, that was absolutely the best job you could imagine ever having. And I would still be doing it if I could, but it turns out when you get to be 60, then it's not as easy to do. But so I spent the first 2 years on the fly team in Pakistan. And every day I will say, it was supposed to be 3 months, but the Pakistanis were mad at us about some things. And so nobody else could get a visa. So they're like, Colton, you're just going to stay until somebody gets a visa. I'm like, okay, 2 years later, I finally get to come home. But that was awesome. I loved it. And I spent nearly every day driving to some place in Pakistan, interviewing people, Al-Qaeda type people, Pakistani Taliban, Afghan Taliban, Lashkar-e-Taiba, terrorist organization that likes to attack India on behalf of Pakistan, essentially. And it was fascinating because we had Lashkar-e-Taiba kind of over on the right attacking India. We had the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's on the left with Afghanistan and the like. And the north, we had the Tajik and some other groups who were also fighting. And on the south, we had the Balochistan separatists going on. Right? So it was a fascinating place to be. There was just stuff everywhere, no shortage of people to talk to. And our priority, though, was always to figure out where bin Laden was. And we'll talk more about that later. So that was always our top priority. But then we were trying to figure out who had conducted, there were attacks going on everywhere, who had conducted those, right? Prevent future attacks, and figure out what is the relationship between all these groups, because they'd have partnerships, loose and otherwise, but figuring that out and figure out how are they getting funding, how are they getting training, and all of that. So no end of stuff to talk to them about as well. But right when that guy walks in the room, they all had a genuine reason not to want to talk to me. Right? Fair enough, they're terrorists. They don't want to share their terrorist stuff. I get it. But in the end, they did talk to me, and it was about that engaging with them and listening to them. And if I allowed them to tell their story, right, within that story was almost always the path to the information that I needed. Right? I just had to listen for that cue that, okay, this is where I want to go now, but it started with listening. When I walked in and decided I'm just going to bulldoze that path, right, I'd fail. But when I allowed that path to emerge through the conversation, then I'd get what I wanted. And I have these two photos up here just because I drove everywhere in Pakistan, and it's an absolute nightmare to drive in Pakistan. So if you're planning a driving trip around the world, I'd kind of go around Pakistan. And I'd also skip Nigeria, really, because that's also not a pleasant place to drive. But after Pakistan, with the flight team, I ended up in Nigeria. And in Pakistan, I had kind of the weight of the U.S. Embassy behind me in a way. They already had contacts with the Pakistani intelligence service and the different police organizations and military. I didn't have to create those. I just had to create relationships with the terrorists I was talking to, but not with the government people. I arrived in Nigeria, and the people that within the government I needed to be talking to, the embassy didn't have those contacts. So my job there was different and more difficult in a way, because first, I had to go out and talk to all these different government people and get them to agree that it'd be okay to work with me. Right? And again, if I showed up there and said, right, here's my agenda, here's what I need from you, they're going to say, well, thanks for coming, bye, good luck. Right? So instead, I had to listen to their story. Right? What frustrations do they have? What concerns do they have? What problems are they dealing with? And just listen to all that, and then take my agenda and kind of align it with that. And in the end, I did get them to allow me access to almost everything. And it was cool. I got to see almost all of Nigeria and all the surrounding companies. So Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and Benin. And if we have time later, there's a fun story from Benin, so I'll tell you about that. But I want to go to this story instead. So given the contacts that I'd made, whenever an attack would happen, let me back up, I missed a key point here. So why was I in Nigeria? There's a terrorist group there called Boko Haram, and they were conducting attacks and kidnappings and bank robberies and everything all over Nigeria. But for some reason, which I still don't understand to this day, the US had not designated them as a foreign terrorist organization. So my role over there was to gather evidence and intelligence that would support that designation. Right? And ultimately successful in that. But I responded to all the different terrorist attacks that I could. The guys in the government knew now to call me, and that I would be an asset if I showed up to them. So they would call me when attacks happened. So this one was at a police station in Kano, right outside of Kano, Nigeria, up north where Boko Haram is based. And I show up there, and unfortunately most of the police have been killed. So it's a rather depressing place to be with dead guys around, so I won't describe that really. But photographs here, I was collecting evidence of the types of explosives and stuff that had been used in the attack. So I'm standing here, I'm taking I was taking the photos either on the bottom left or the upper right, so I know what happened was right next to this building. And all of a sudden I hear a guy say, "Sir, I need to talk to you." And my first thought was this fear I had that somebody high within the Nigerian government was finally going to show up and say, "Why are you here? Get out of here." So I'm like, kind of freeze. But I turn around and my reaction was like, yeah, because there's this guy standing there and he's like, "Sir, I need to talk to you." I'm like, "No, you don't, because you have shrapnel in your head and you're bleeding everywhere." Right? It was like, I had no idea how to respond, but my response was, "What you need actually is medical help right now." Right? And he's like, "No, I need to talk to you." I'm like, "Okay, so engagement. What do you need to tell me?" Right? And he ends up, he'd seen the entire attack, and he's able to give me the intelligence I needed, exactly how that entire attack had unfolded and what happened. Right? I had the physical evidence, but I didn't have any eyewitnesses because most of them were dead. Right? So, but he'd seen it, and getting over my reaction and my response that you need medical help and then we'll deal with that, because that's not what he needed. He needed to tell that story. Right? And he wanted to tell that story regardless of what was happening to him. Right? Ultimately, I did get him the help, and I got the information that I needed. And with the access that I was given by the Nigerians, I was able to demonstrate that Boko Haram had connections with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Al-Shabaab over on the right. So they had connections with other terrorist organizations. One way that I was able to show that was this battery was actually surprisingly important, because that battery was not for sale anywhere in Nigeria. So we knew that explosives components were being brought into Nigeria from elsewhere, and that helped. And then I took swabs at all the explosions that happened, and I was able to show that the explosives that were being used were way more complex than were available in Nigeria or to Boko Haram. So putting those together, plus all the people I talked to who provided me information about people traveling in and out of Nigeria, I was able to put that together, that Boko Haram should be designated. And with the HIG, which we'll talk about in a moment, and with the fly team, I did get to go to more than 20 countries around the world, and it was fantastic, and I would love to tell stories about every one of them, but there is other stuff that I want to talk about tonight. So in 2009, the same year that I joined the fly team, President Obama had become president, and he was wrestling with the whole deal with enhanced interrogation techniques, right? And are those effective, right? And should we be using them? And if they're not effective, what else should we be doing, right? And so and for the record, they are absolutely not effective, just in case anybody's not clear on that, right? They do not get you good intelligence or information, and part of that is because when you use enhanced interrogation, you literally change people's brains so they can't access the information that you're trying to get, right? You've actually cut off the access to that information. So, but we didn't know that at the time. So President Obama put together a task force to look at what do we know about interviewing and interrogation, and what should we be doing? And so the task force looked into it, and gist of what they found is that we know basically nothing. That the US government has done absolutely no research to generate actual science behind interviewing and interrogation since the Korean War, right? So we've gone more than half a century based on folk wisdom, right? Based on what the guy before me did, what somebody else thinks works, but there's no science behind it, right? So the task force recommended to Obama that he create a group responsible for doing that research, and that became the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. So the primary role of the HIG, which was an interagency group, is CIA, FBI, and DoD. So their primary role was to conduct the research in how do we have difficult conversations with people who do not want to talk to us. And from those conversations, how do we get better intelligence, better information from them? Right, so that was the first order of the HIG, was to do that. The second was now to lead the high value interrogations around the world. So in 2014, after I'd been all over with the fly team, I got asked by the director of the HIG to come over to the HIG. So he calls me up one day and just says, "Come over to my office." I kind of knew who he was, so I'm like, okay, sure. I had no idea that he was going to ask me to transfer over there, but what he said was that he needed somebody to take the research that had been done and develop a scientifically valid operational methodology of interacting with other people to get information that we could train to other people. So that became my role, was taking all the research that had been done so far and putting it together into a coherent methodology, and then to train it to all the US interrogators, essentially. Right? So I still got to go lead some of the teams to go interview people, because that's what I loved, but it also became kind of an all-consuming part of my life, pulling all this together and finding out what do we still not know and how do we fill all of those gaps. So it became intellectually fascinating thing. So I'd say about the second best job ever. Flight team best job ever, but this second best job ever. I did get to travel all over the world to meet with the academics who are working on this to try to figure out what their research meant and how it fit into a bigger program. And as I was pulling this together, what I figured out was that it wasn't just about talking to terrorists, right? That was our primary goal, was to talk to terrorists. This guy we didn't get to talk to because he got droned in 2009, I think. So, weird guy, American guy who lived in Yemen and was really high up in Al-Qaeda. But it wasn't just about talking to terrorists and guys like him. It was really about talking to anyone. Right? What we had figured out was about how do we talk to other people, especially other people who don't agree with us. Right? So in the law enforcement sense, right, it was certainly about talking to subjects, but it was also about talking to victims and witnesses. I've interviewed a lot of victims and witnesses in my career, and I can guarantee you that almost none of those people want to be having that conversation with me. Right? They are inherently a difficult conversation. So it's how do we get better at that? Because as law enforcement, we are absolutely terrible at interviewing victims, especially because we interview them just like subjects, right, which shuts them down. So how do we change that dynamic? And that's what we learned. And in the rest of the world, right, it applies to how do you talk to your neighbor who has more yard signs than you think he should have, or who thinks mowing the lawn at 6:30 in the morning is a good plan. So how do you have those conversations, right, with people who see the world differently? So what I want to talk about and give you something to take away from with tonight, other than stories, is a little bit of the research that we did, and kind of walk through that with some examples. So one of the primary things that when we started off the research that we were looking at was about rapport. And what is rapport? How do we develop rapport with other people? And what does it really look like? Because what we've been taught was that it's about being nice to other people, and it's about finding something in common with them, right? That's all fine and good, right? It's not going to hurt a conversation, but it also is not going to allow you to have a difficult conversation with someone who does not want to talk to you, right? Or who fundamentally sees the world differently than you do, right? Rapport is a lot more complex than that. And what we found was that rapport happens at 3 different levels. And we have to get in sync with somebody at all these levels. So the first level is about affect. Affect is just that internal feeling of, I like this or I don't like this, essentially. Right? Our brain, when we come to a conversation, is mapping that conversation to threat or safety. Right? We want to do specific things that tells their subconscious, map it to safety, not threat. And so for that, I developed a model called the BASE model, which is up there. That's belonging, agency, security, and empathy. If we do those 4 things well in a conversation, we promote belonging, we promote autonomy, agency, we provide security, psychological and physical, and empathy, which is really hard to train people on because everybody confuses it with sympathy. But if we do those 4 things well, now we can have that conversation. If we don't do them or we do them poorly, that shuts down communication. So we don't have time to go deeper on that. But next, affect, that internal feeling, creates behaviors. Right? It's the external manifestation of what's happening within somebody. We also have to deal with that. And we have to balance our behavior with their behavior so that the conversation works. And we are going to look more deeply at that in a second. And third is cognition, which is affect and behavior combined create how somebody is thinking about this conversation, this situation, right? They're more aware of it than they are the affect and the behavior, right? And it's about their motivation. What are they motivated to promote or share, and how they're doing that? We have to get in sync with them and how they're talking, the words they're using, the way they're talking. And we have a model called sense making that helps with that. But let's look at the behavior. Right. So with two researchers, Lawrence and Emily Allison at the University of Liverpool, flew over there right when I got on the Hig and worked for years with them to develop this model of interpersonal behavior. The underlying this is the fact that behavior does not happen in a vacuum, right? We don't bring behaviors with us to a conversation. Behavior happens, it generates in response to something else. Behavior is always in response to something. And in a communication, right, my behavior is in response to the behavior of the person I'm talking to, and theirs is in response to mine, right? And so our behaviors kind of come together, they interact to create the dynamic of that conversation for good or bad. And if you look at the wheels for a minute, there's a lot there, but see it basically, there's a good wheel and a bad wheel. There's adaptive behaviors and maladaptive behaviors. So good behaviors and bad behaviors. And the way the wheels work is, so if we look at them, on the top is in charge and setting the agenda of the good wheel. On top of the bad wheel is demanding and rigid. There's a continuum between those two things. Those are the same behavior, but a good expression of it and a bad expression of it. Right? And it's the same for all other 7 places on the wheel. So frank and forthright, good behavior. Attacking and punishing, bad behavior. But they're the same behaviors, just a good and a bad expression of them. Right? So just quick how the wheels work, but our first goal is that we need to always keep our behavior in a difficult conversation adaptive, right? No matter what is happening with the person we're talking to, because remember, behavior influences behavior. If I'm dealing with somebody who's maladaptive, who is argumentative and competitive, right, they're going to pull me over to the maladaptive wheel if I'm not paying attention, and I'm going to start arguing and competing with them, rather than being confident and assertive, which is the good version of that behavior. So we want to keep our behavior there and recognize that they can pull us to the bad wheel. The most important thing, though, is that my behavior, adaptive behavior, can pull them over to the good wheel. And we're going to look at an example of that in a minute. But first we need to look kind of underneath the wheels, which underneath each wheel, so this is the adaptive wheel, but same with the maladaptive wheel, there are 2 axes, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. So the vertical axis is about power. Who wants to be in charge of that situation? Who wants to be in control, right? Versus low power, which is, yeah, I don't need to be in control. You can, cool, good, right? What happens when you have 2 people talking who both want to be in control of that conversation? You're fighting with each other over it, right? What happens if you have 2 people who don't want to be in control? Nothing. Right? So if somebody's high power in a conversation, they come into that conversation high power, they want to control the agenda, fine, cool, let them. Lower your power, right? It doesn't mean we're giving up control of the conversation. It means we're adaptively responding to what's happening to allow this conversation to happen, right? They come in high power, we go low power. If they come in low power, we go high power. And we can change, we'll move later, but that's the first response. Just deal with the power, go high or low. The horizontal axis is about competition or collaboration. So on the left side of the wheel, if you're confident and assertive or argumentative and competitive on the bad wheel, you want to compete, right? On the other side, you want to collaborate, you want to get along, right? Supportive and engaged is about getting along and figuring out how we're going to solve this problem. Now, if I come to a conversation and I want to be competitive and the other person's like, dude, chill out, let's just get along, I'm not going to be happy, right? I want that competition, right? So, and it's more about the substance of the conversation. I want to compete on the substance of this conversation. So, but we can do that adaptively. So this axis works differently. If somebody is competitive, we meet that competition, right? If they want to be collaborative, we meet that, so we go the same place. So with the power, we go the opposite, but the competition axis, we go the same where they are, right? So give you an example here. So say you're talking to someone and they're on the opposite side of the political spectrum as you. So maybe they support Democrats and they're like, Trump has absolutely no idea about tariffs or what he's talking about or how tariffs even work, right? Or they say Biden was a complete disaster on immigration and had no idea how to deal with immigration, right? So where are they on the wheels right now? Right? Argumentative and competitive, right? They want competition and they're also kind of higher power, right? They're pushing stuff forward, right? And it's not really a positive place yet, right? But if we want to have a conversation about that, what do we need to do? We need to lower our power a little bit, but meet that competition, which if we look at the wheels as patient and questioning, that's where the colors come into play, right? So their argument and competitive, we want adaptive behavior, so we go to patient and questioning. Right? And when we do that, we're not arguing with them, we're not giving them competition that they're wrong. We're saying things like, I'm curious where you got this information, or I'm curious how you came to feel this way. Right? We're challenging them, but we're challenging them in a lower power way. Right? What happens next is they're going to move from argumentative and competitive to confident and assertive. They're still going to be telling me what they believe, but it's less argumentative, and now they're just asserting the things that they believe. Right? They're moving to more adaptive behavior because my behavior has pulled them over there. Right? Now I can change and move up to frank and forthright and say, right, you've said this, here are the facts that I've seen. What they're going to do is move down to frank and forthright and meet me there and say, and here are the facts that I've seen. Right? But now we can talk about those facts. It's not arguing about ideology. It's about meeting them there and talking about that. Right? So that's how behavior affects behavior. I'm going to give one more example. In 2011, right, I was in Pakistan and raid on the bin Laden compound. He gets killed. His 3 wives get brought into custody. And to my surprise, the Pakistanis said, you guys can have access to him and talk to him. And so my inclination, thinking about it, was that we should sympathize with them and apologize for what happened and convince them why they should talk to us. That, based on what I've been taught, that's kind of what I thought. But fortunately, I had now started to understand this research that was out there. Right? I wasn't quite an expert at it yet, but I started to understand it. So what I decided was that we actually need to just be direct with them, right? Not sympathizing with them. So on the wheels, if we'd come in and apologized and sympathized and then tried to convince them why they should talk to us, we would have been over supportive and engaged, and we probably would have ended up on the maladaptive wheel of parental and patronizing, right? Depending on delivery, but pretty easy to end up at patronizing. Really sorry this happened, terrible thing, blah, 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 right? We're just patronizing. Where do you think the wives were? Were they happy with us? Yeah, not especially, right? In addition to killing bin Laden, we'd also killed their sons and a whole bunch of other guys who were living there. So they were not happy with us, right? So assume they were going to come in attacking and punishing or passive and resentful, right? So our response was, we recognize that this situation is difficult. I want to explain why this situation happened. Why did we come into your compound, and why are we here talking to you now? And here's what we want to talk to you about. And they were really quiet for a long time. And I was like, well, that failed dramatically. Great. A little worried. But then they started talking. And they actually provided us a lot of information about what had happened since 9/11. Right? It worked, right? Because they didn't want our apology. They didn't want our fake sympathy, right? They wanted to know if they could trust us. And coming in at frank and forthright, saying, yep, here's exactly why this happened, and here's why we're here, and here's what we want to talk to you about, they made that decision that they could trust us. Unfortunately for me, can't remember exactly when it was, but it was like very soon into the interview with the wives, the Pakistanis, for reasons that I never did figure out, decided that no men were allowed in the building anymore. So I was done, and I got pulled out, and that actually worked out pretty well for me because, there we go. Shortly after, we also got access to bin Laden's compound, and I ended up getting to do that. But what happened was, it was kind of funny because I'd done interviews in Pakistan about the compound and trying to figure out what was going on in this compound and who was there, et cetera. But the number of people who were read into it was bin Laden's compound was very, very small, and I was not part of that group. But I'm doing the interviews about this compound, so I'm like interviewing, and I'm like, I don't even know why we're talking about this compound, so this is weird. But I did get information about it, so that was helpful. And then shortly before the raid, a friend of mine calls me up and he says, I need you to put together a briefing for me to give the Navy SEALs on sensitive site exploitation, which is essentially collecting evidence when you're under fire in the middle of the night. Right. And the flight team had developed the protocol for that. It's called SSE. And flight team had developed the SSE protocol, and we trained it to the Navy SEALs and all the different groups. So getting a request for that wasn't that unusual. So I was like, yeah, sure, put it together, give it to the guy. And a few days later, I realized he'd taken my presentation and briefed the Navy SEALs who went into the compound. And I was like, come on, man, that's not cool. But the night of the raid, we get brought into the embassy, and now everybody's read in on exactly what's happening, and here's what's going to happen. All right, so, and then we're told, yeah, email or text your family and tell them that you're okay and you'll be in touch later. And so I think my family got that email and said, huh? Right? But so we do that, the raid happens, and we're all prepared to get out of Pakistan because we figure the Pakistanis are going to be really unhappy with us for invading their country, and then when we crashed a helicopter there, they're even going to be more unhappy with us. So we have all of our exfil plans in place to get out of the country. They weren't happy with us, absolutely they were not, but wasn't as bad as we thought. And the embassy was able to arrange for us to go up to the compound again and collect whatever else had been, the SEALs weren't able to get, and also to document the compound. So I go to the guy at the embassy who I knew was coordinating this, and I said, hey, I should be on your team because I led our crime scene team in Alaska. I'm the guy who knows how to do this. And he says, yeah, I'll consider it, which I figured was a polite no. But he actually comes back a couple hours later and says, yeah, you're on the team and you're also the team lead, which was slightly terrifying. But so I'm running around, getting all the equipment together and everything, and then we have to fly up there on a Pakistani helicopter. So we go to Rawalpindi Air Force Base there to get on the helicopter, but then we find ourselves sitting around for like hours, just in this awkward room drinking tea and nothing's happening. So I think the Pakistanis were still like, do we really want them to go up there? But then Secretary Clinton went on the news and said, there is a second team en route to Abbottabad now. I'm like, no, we're not. We're sitting here doing nothing. Right? But I think that was her way of forcing their hand, which was cool. It worked. But now I'm also terrified because that crowd looked small. There were huge crowds around there at the time. And I'm like, great, now they all know that the Americans are coming. This is, my safety kind of sense is not real high right now. But we get in the helicopter and we're flying up there, and they don't close the door on the helicopter, and I'm just waiting for them to just push us out of the helicopter. Right? But we get there, and I want to mention a couple things about the compound real quick. There was a trash burning pile in the field next to it, and they didn't want any information coming in or going out of the compound. I mean, they didn't want anything leaving the compound that could identify who was there, so they put it all in this burn pile. Good thing for us was that they were kind of lazy, and they would just light a couple pieces of paper on fire and call that burning it. So there's about 4 feet deep of all kinds of CDs and notebooks and all this other stuff that I got to dig out and bring back. So we did get the intelligence we were looking for. And over, if you look at it, on the 3rd floor, there's the balcony. It says 7-foot-high privacy wall. That was bin Laden's room. And it had no windows. It's got a 7-foot wall that he can't see over. At night, he would go wander around under those arbors kind of over on the right. but he couldn't see over the 18-foot walls. So his entire view of the world was basically nothing, right? So what he'd done was he'd taken a screwdriver or a pen or something and dug a hole in the wall of his bedroom like this. And it was interesting. You could tell that he'd done it by hand because, on the outside it was really small, and on the inside it was bigger from this motion, right? And that really was his entire view of the world, was looking out that small little hole in his bedroom, which to me was absolutely fascinating. But when I tell that story, I think most people see it as me saying, right, bin Laden getting what he deserved, and I think he did get what he deserved, no argument there, but it's also about seeing bin Laden as a human being, right? Someone who wanted to experience the world just like we all do, right? Not inherently evil, a human being who did bad things, right? And that's why I wanted to talk to him, because after that I was like, God, I wish I could have talked to you, because seeing him in that light just changed everything for me. That made me think, right, being a human being is difficult, and if you're Osama bin Laden, it's still difficult, right? No matter who you are. And seeing how much he wanted to experience stuff that he couldn't humanized him for me, where I'd spent a decade of my life basically chasing after him and seeing him as evil. In that moment really humanized him for me, and it kind of changed it. Still did terrible things, absolutely no argument there, but it changed the way I felt about him. So I'll come back to the compound here for a minute. When we're getting ready to leave, I'm kind of to the left of that small little building in the center, and I'm packing up all the evidence, and all the Pakistani guys are sitting around staring at me and kind of arms folded, and I'm like, I don't think they're going to let me take this evidence with me. And so I'm trying to figure out what I should do, and I had a bunch of laser measures with me that we were using to measure the compound so that we could do sketches like this and preserve it. And they'd been fascinated by those, and rightfully so. Like when I first got my laser measurer, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, right? And so I get up and I get all the measures out and I pass them out to the Pakistani guys and say, hey, thank you for keeping us safe here. Thank you for letting us come up here. And they're now lasering each other all over the place. And I'm quietly packing up all the evidence into the truck and getting ready to go. So that worked. Right, so I want to wrap this up and leave time for questions, and hopefully you guys have them. But to sum up, what I've been talking about is that when we face a difficult conversation, it's really about making the attempt to see that situation from somebody else's perspective, right? And it's about listening, right? And rather than reacting and responding, it's about listening and engaging, right? Asking those questions. Tell me more about that. Help me understand how you came to that point of view, right? Not challenging it directly, but letting them expand on it. And it's about being curious, right? It's listening to those stories and finding that path to where you need to be within that story, but you only get there through curiosity, right? If you're trying to control it, you're not going to get there. And ultimately, when we do those things well, right, we begin to change the perspective from moving away from our perspective and getting to somebody else's perspective. We'll say a caveat there is we very often use the language, we tell people, I really understand what you're saying. And be careful with that, because you don't, right? You cannot understand what is happening inside somebody else's head because you have no access to that, right? So being aware of that it's through asking good questions, through engaging with people, we're demonstrating that we're making an attempt to see it from their point of view. We'll never understand it completely, but we're making that attempt. And in doing that, that's what opens people up, even if it's a difficult thing to talk about. Right, I mentioned interviewing witnesses or victims. I had to talk to a lot of victims about things that absolutely nobody in the world would ever want to talk about, right? Including me. I did not want to be there having that conversation, right? But allowing them to feel that I was making the attempt to see it from their perspective allowed them to open up and tell me really difficult things, right? And it was exactly the same with the terrorists, right? I'm seeing it from their perspective, I'm listening to their stories, and I'm finding that path to where I need to be. Oh, I have to say a name of a book I will remember, but those pictures I have to shout out to my friend Amy Herman, who wrote a book called Visual Intelligence, and she put some of my pictures in one of her books. So I'm super excited that I'm now a famous photographer. All right, so with that, I really thank you all for listening to me tonight.
So we have time for one or two questions, and I just ask that when you can pick whoever you want, but just try to repeat the question for the video. So this is being videoed, and it will be available on our website in about a week. But it won't pick up the questions unless Colton repeats them. So, anybody have a question?
To what degree are U.S. military intelligence organizations tuned into what you're talking about?
Yeah, so what degree is the U.S. military, especially intelligence gathering, tuned into the research we did at the Hague and what I'm talking about? At this point, almost completely. So the role of the Hague was to train those people on this, and I've trained about 10,000 people in my career at this point. So there was a lot of resistance at first, especially from guys who'd been doing interrogations for 20 years, or 10 years, and they're like, I got it. And it's a 5-day course that we'd put them through, and usually by about the 3rd day, they'd be like, wow, now I understand why all those interrogations that didn't work, right? So it was a mindset change, and it took a while, but now they're pretty on board with it. Yeah.
Do your techniques vary when you're dealing with younger children?
So how does it vary in dealing with younger children, or does it vary? It does. I'm not an expert on child interviewing, but I've worked on it some, and you have to be extra careful with children not to be leading, right? And children want to live up to your expectations of them. So it's controlling for that you're not signaling what you want them to say. And that it's important with anybody, but especially with children on those things. Yeah, cool. In the back first, and then we'll come there.
What were you like as a kid? I mean, did you show any of these traits? And then when you joined, why did you want to join the FBI? What did you imagine you were going to be?
So what was I like as a kid, and why did I get in the FBI? I have no idea what I was like with a kid as a kid, but I can say I am not naturally an extrovert. I'm very introverted, really, and talking to other people I thought was awkward for me until I learned how to do it, and then I'm like, so I probably was much more introverted as a kid, and now I love it. FBI was absolutely by accident. I was an analyst, and we got a contract with the FBI to look at some industrial espionage stuff, and so I ended up working with FBI agents, and they're like, dude, you absolutely should be an FBI agent. And I'm like, I have a ponytail and earrings. But they convinced me, and I'm like, fine, I'll apply. I'm never going to get in, less than 1% of the people who apply get in, so safe bet. And whatever reason, there I was. Yeah.
Have you found these frameworks to be useful across the many different cultures that you've been in, or are there variations in how effective it is in different cultures?
Yeah, so looking at how this works across different cultures, and absolutely there are things that we have to adjust somewhat because cultures vary dramatically on different scales. And if you're familiar with Garrett Hofstede, I use his scales a lot to figure out how do we adjust these. Like if it's a high individual culture, what's going to change, right? And those types of things. So it does, it's complicated, but yeah. I think there's one way over there, yeah.
Could you say a little bit about the difference between empathy and sympathy in terms of your work?
Cool. So the difference between empathy and sympathy. So sympathy is I'll back up. So if somebody has died and they tell you that somebody has died, what is your natural response to that? I'm so sorry for your loss, right? Who is that about? It's about you, right? I am so sorry, right? It's not about them, right? And that's sympathy, right? Now, empathy is turning that around and having your response be about them, right? and being willing to ask those questions. How have you experienced that? How have you been dealing with that, right? Or like when my wife died, the best question I was asked by people was, tell me about what she was like, right? No, I'm sorry, nothing. I'll say quickly, like, I got so tired of the I'm sorry that I finally would tell people, you didn't kill her, so don't worry about it. Bad response, maladaptive wheel, but... right? So,
Finish, we'll take that last question.
okay.
In all the talking you've done tonight about all the conversations you've had, you mentioned not once the presence of a translator. How did you do these?
In Pakistan, I was able to do a lot of them in English because there was enough English spoken there, but I have used translators all around the world. And the key with translators is that your translator has to know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it and how these models work. So with the HIG and the Fly team, we actually trained our translators on everything that we were doing so that they could translate the intent as well as the words. Right? But there's one time in Pakistan, my translator, we were in a prison somewhere way out in the middle of nowhere, and get a really long answer, and he'd just give me the short translation, and I'm like, no. He's like, no, I'll just tell you what's important. I'm like, no. And he wouldn't change, so I went and found this guy who'd been driving me around out there who kind of spoke English, and I said, you are now my translator. Other guy, go sit in the car. So, but they're hard to work with, but I loved working with them.
David, do you want to? This is David Beltate, the president of the Civic Center.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So interesting.
Thank you.
And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation.
Wow, thank you. I thought you just brought somebody a Christmas present when I saw you walk in with that.
Don't worry, it's not a Christmas present. A few other announcements. Please join us for a reception afterwards. And if you care to sign up for our next...
Yeah, that's going to be Vash.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Oops.
We'll get back to the original.
There we go.
There we go. Next month. There he is. You can just call him Dr. Vash. Yeah.
See Laura as you exit. And while we're here, we also have exhibits in the building. What you see in here is New Hampshire Pastel Society, and it's called the Palette of Prestige. And in the showcases in the lobby is Susan Gary's felt displays, felt experience. And upstairs in the upper gallery, the family, the Eismont family at Family Retrospective. And we also have a Christmas village upstairs. Tomorrow is a crafts fair from 10 to 3. Please come by if you wish. And I'd like to thank Jan Duval, my wife, for the reception. And I'd also like to thank Laura and Karen, who operate this place and keep it spiffy and working like a well-oiled machine. So, and also, please, everyone, come again. And please remember, we're a non-profit. This doesn't work on air.
Thank you very much. That's great.